It was an ordinary Saturday afternoon when it all began. The mall was buzzing with the usual crowd. Families out shopping, teenagers hanging out, and older couples strolling leisurely through the aisles. The hum of chatter and the sound of footsteps echoed through the air, mixing with the soft music playing in the background. At the food court, a group of young men laughed as they shared stories, while nearby, a mother was trying to calm her restless toddler. Everything seemed as it should be, calm, unassuming, and predictable. But for Clara Johnson, it would soon be anything but ordinary. Clara, a woman in her late 60s, had lived in the city for nearly 4 decades. Known for her warm smile and gentle demeanor, she was a staple in her community. Her home was a gathering place for family, her kitchen filled with the smells of comforting dishes that she had perfected over the years. But today, Clara was just another shopper, taking her time in the mall, picking out some items for her grandchildren. She wasn't in any rush, enjoying the simple pleasure of a quiet day out. As Clara passed by a department store, her cart filled with groceries, she noticed a man walking toward her. At first, she didn't think much of it, as there were so many people around. But the man's gaze was intense, and his approach was direct. He wore a uniform, an officer's uniform, with the badge clearly visible. "Ma'am," the cop called out, his voice sharp and commanding. Clara turned toward him, a friendly smile already forming on her face, assuming it was just a polite inquiry. But the officer didn't offer a greeting or an explanation. Instead, his next words made her stop in her tracks. "Are you lost, ma'am? You shouldn't be here, at least not without a reason." His tone was cold, laced with something Clara couldn't quite place. Contempt, maybe, or indifference. Clara's smile faltered, confusion crossing her face. "I'm just shopping for my grandchildren," she said gently, her voice calm as always. She made an effort to keep her composure, not wanting to escalate the situation. "I'm not lost." But the cop didn't seem to care about her explanation. He didn't apologize or ask if she needed assistance. Instead, he stared her down with a look that was almost dismissive, as though he didn't believe her or care to. "I said you shouldn't be here. Why are you really here, huh?" Clara stood there, her confusion turning to frustration. She wasn't used to being treated like this. Sure, she had heard stories about people being harassed by the police, but never once did she think it would happen to her, especially not in a mall, of all places. The cop took a step closer, his body language shifting from just curious to something much more threatening. His eyes narrowed, and he raised his voice. "You think I don't know what you're up to? People like you don't belong in places like this. Maybe you should leave before I make you." Clara's heart began to race. The situation was turning from bad to worse. The cop was now too close, his presence making her feel small and vulnerable. She tried to back away, but the officer blocked her path. "I'm not going anywhere," Clara said, her voice firm but still respectful. "I don't know what this is about, but I'm just trying to get my shopping done." But the cop wasn't interested in hearing her out. He grabbed her arm roughly, pulling her toward the security office. Clara winced in pain, her heart pounding in her chest. "Let me go," she exclaimed, feeling a surge of fear and anger rise within her. She didn't understand why this was happening. She had done nothing wrong, nothing to deserve this treatment. As she struggled to break free from his grip, a few bystanders began to notice, some even recording the incident on their phones. A young woman stepped forward, her voice shaking but strong. "Hey, leave her alone." She shouted at the officer, but the cop just glared at her, dismissing her with a cold, unbothered stare. Clara tried again to pull away, but it was no use. The officer's hold tightened, and her breathing grew more erratic. She was being dragged, humiliated in front of strangers, her dignity slipping away with every step. "This is wrong," she whispered to herself, barely able to keep her tears at bay. The mall was quiet for a moment, as if the crowd was waiting for someone to intervene. But nobody did. Everyone just watched, some too scared to speak up, others unsure of how to help. In that moment, Clara's entire world seemed to narrow down to the cold metal of the officer's grip and the rising tide of panic in her chest. She was alone, alone in the fight for her dignity, her rights, her very sense of self. But little did she know, things were about to change. Her son, Marcus, was just finishing up his afternoon meeting. A successful lawyer in the city, Marcus had always been the rock of the family. He was the one who had made sure his mother was well cared for, checking in with her regularly, making sure she wasn't alone when she went out. That's when he received the call, a call that would change everything. "Marcus, it's your mother," the voice on the other end of the line said, trembling. "You need to get to the mall. Now. Something's happened." The words hit Marcus like a thunderbolt. His heart dropped into his stomach as he hung up the phone. Something had happened to Clara, and he couldn't waste another second. As he rushed out of his office and into his car, Marcus felt a sense of urgency, but also a cold, simmering rage. Who would dare harm his mother? Who would disrespect her, let alone assault her in public? He knew he had to get there fast, and when he did, things would never be the same again. By the time Marcus reached the mall, the scene had already begun to spiral out of control. The cop's grip on Clara was unrelenting, and her face was a mixture of fear and confusion. The officer had no idea what was about to hit him. The tension in the mall had escalated into a near boiling point by the time Marcus arrived. He could feel it in the air as he stepped into the entrance, the muffled murmur of the crowd, the uneasy energy that radiated from the scene ahead. People were gathered in clusters, some with phones out, recording the incident as if documenting a wildfire spreading out of control. Marcus pushed through the throng, his eyes scanning desperately for his mother. What he saw next made his blood run cold. Clara was seated on the floor, leaning against a bench, her face pale and her hand clutching her arm. The officer loomed over her, his expression unreadable but his posture threatening. The crowd, though seemingly in shock, maintained a safe distance, unsure of how to intervene. Marcus's heart pounded as he fought the surge of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. Anger, fear, and disbelief collided in his chest as he took in the sight of his mother. His strong, resilient mother, reduced to such a vulnerable state. What the hell is going on here? Marcus's voice sliced through the tense silence like a whip. Heads turned as his commanding presence demanded attention. He was impeccably dressed, his tailored suit and polished demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding before him. The officer looked up, his face a mixture of annoyance and surprise. "Who are you?" the cop demanded, his tone dismissive. He squared his shoulders, clearly unprepared for the force of Marcus's entry into the scene. "I'm her son," Marcus replied, his voice low and steady, though it trembled with barely restrained fury. He moved to Clara's side, kneeling beside her and gently taking her hand. "Mom, are you okay?" he asked, his tone soft and full of concern. Clara nodded weakly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I'm fine, Marcus," she said, though her voice betrayed the pain she was feeling. "It's just this officer." Her words faltered, but Marcus didn't need her to finish. The bruises forming on her arm and the sheer terror in her eyes told him everything he needed to know. Marcus rose to his feet, turning his attention to the officer. His jaw was set, and his eyes blazed with determination. "You assaulted my mother?" he asked, his voice cold and sharp. The question wasn't really a question. It was an accusation, a statement of fact that hung in the air like a guillotine blade about to fall. The officer scoffed, attempting to regain his composure. "Look, she was causing a disturbance," he said, his voice defensive. "I was just doing my job." "Your job?" Marcus's voice rose slightly, incredulity dripping from every word. "Your job is to protect and serve, not to harass and assault elderly women." She was resisting. The officer shot back, his tone growing more hostile. "I had no choice." Marcus's laugh was humorless, a sharp and cutting sound. "Resisting," he repeated. "Resisting what exactly?" shopping for groceries, being black in a public space. Explain to me what crime my mother committed that justified you putting your hands on her." The officer faltered, his bravado beginning to crack under the weight of Marcus's relentless questioning. The crowd, emboldened by Marcus's presence, began murmuring more loudly, their discontent becoming harder to ignore. Several bystanders stepped closer, their phones still recording. The officer shifted uncomfortably, the realization dawning that this situation was rapidly spiraling out of his control. As the tension continued to mount, a second officer arrived on the scene. A younger man, his face pale and uneasy. He approached cautiously, clearly sensing the volatile nature of the situation. "What's going on here?" he asked, his gaze flickering between Marcus, Clara, and his colleague. Marcus didn't hesitate. "What's going on," he said, his voice like steel, "is that your colleague assaulted my mother without provocation. And now he's trying to justify his actions with lies and intimidation." The younger officer looked visibly uncomfortable. He glanced at the crowd, at the phones pointed in their direction, and then at his colleague, who was starting to look more like a cornered animal than an authoritative figure. "We need to de-escalate this," he said, his voice low. "Let's talk this out." "There's nothing to talk out," Marcus snapped. "What needs to happen is an apology to my mother, followed by the immediate suspension of your colleague here. And trust me, I'll be filing a formal complaint. This isn't over." The older officer bristled at Marcus's words, but before he could respond, a voice from the crowd interrupted. "We've got everything on video," a young woman shouted, holding up her phone. "We saw what happened, and we're not letting this slide." More voices joined in, echoing her sentiment. "Justice for Clara," someone yelled, and the chant began to pick up momentum. The officer's face grew red as he realized the full extent of the situation. He wasn't just facing Marcus's wrath. He was facing the collective anger of a community that had reached its breaking point. Amid the chaos, Clara struggled to her feet, aided by Marcus and a kind-hearted bystander. She looked around at the crowd, her expression a mixture of gratitude and weariness. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the noise. "Thank you for standing up for me." Marcus put a protective arm around his mother, his resolve solidified. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person who had ever been mistreated, disrespected, or dehumanized by those in power. He knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but he was ready to fight. For Clara, for justice, for change. Marcus held his mother close, his mind racing as the crowd around them grew louder and more restless. Clara, though visibly shaken, squeezed his hand gently, silently urging him to stay calm. But calm was a distant concept for Marcus now. His mother, the woman who had taught him everything about strength and dignity, had been humiliated and hurt in front of a crowd by someone meant to protect her. The weight of that reality was too heavy to ignore. The officer, now visibly rattled by the growing unrest, took a step back, but Marcus wasn't done. His piercing gaze locked onto the younger officer who had just arrived. "You," Marcus said, his voice steady but simmering with anger. "What's your name?" The younger man hesitated, glancing nervously at his partner. "Officer Daniels," he replied reluctantly. "Well, Officer Daniels, I suggest you step in and do something about your colleague before this situation gets even worse," Marcus said. His words were measured, but the underlying threat was unmistakable. Daniels looked between Marcus, Clara, and the senior officer, clearly unsure of how to proceed. Meanwhile, the crowd continued to grow, their murmurs growing louder, angrier. A middle-aged man in a button-down shirt stepped forward, his phone raised high. "I've got everything on video," he called out. "This officer assaulted that woman without cause. Someone needs to hold him accountable." Other voices chimed in, echoing the man's sentiment. The older officer, now completely on the defensive, turned to Daniels. "Control the crowd," he barked, his tone betraying his rising panic. Daniels looked overwhelmed, but before he could act, Marcus stepped forward again, shielding his mother with his body. "You don't get to give orders anymore," Marcus said coldly. "Not after what you did." The senior officer's face flushed red, his authority crumbling under the weight of public scrutiny. He opened his mouth to respond, but Marcus cut him off. "Let me make this very clear," Marcus continued, his voice rising. "You've already lost. The videos, the witnesses, the truth, it's all against you. The only choice you have now is whether you want to walk away quietly or make things even worse for yourself." The crowd murmured in agreement, their anger now directed squarely at the officer. Clara, still leaning on Marcus for support, looked up at him with a mixture of pride and worry. She could see the fire in his eyes, the same fire he'd always had when standing up for what was right. But she also knew how dangerous this situation could become. "Marcus," she said softly, tugging at his arm. "Please, let's just go." But Marcus shook his head. "No, Mom, not this time. Not after what he did." At that moment, a sharp voice cut through the chaos. "What's going on here?" A woman in her 40s, dressed in a crisp suit, strode into the fray. Her badge, prominently displayed on her hip, identified her as a higher-ranking officer, likely a detective or lieutenant. The crowd parted slightly to let her through, their murmurs subsiding into an expectant hush. The senior officer visibly relaxed at her arrival, though his relief was short-lived. The woman's sharp gaze took in the scene. Clara's bruised arm, Marcus's protective stance, the crowd's accusatory stares, and her expression darkened. "I asked a question," she said, her tone brooking no nonsense. "Someone had better start explaining." Before the older officer could speak, Marcus stepped forward, his voice steady and firm. "This officer assaulted my mother without provocation," he said, his words cutting through the tension like a blade. "And now he's trying to justify his actions by calling her a disturbance. There are witnesses. There's video evidence. I demand that he be held accountable." The detective turned to the senior officer, her expression unreadable. "Is that true?" she asked, her voice deceptively calm. The man stammered, struggling to come up with a response. She was resisting. He finally said, though his words lacked conviction, "I had to act." The detective's eyes narrowed. "Resisting what?" she asked pointedly. "Buying groceries, standing in a public space. Explain to me exactly what threat this elderly woman posed that justified you putting your hands on her." The officer had no answer. The crowd watched in tense silence as the detective's gaze bore into him, her disapproval palpable. Finally, she turned to Daniels. "Did you witness this?" she asked. Daniels hesitated, his face pale. I just got here," he admitted. "But the crowd, they're all saying the same thing." The detective nodded, her expression hardening. "All right," she said. "Officer, hand over your badge and weapon. You're suspended effective immediately, pending an internal investigation." The crowd erupted into cheers and applause, their relief and vindication pouring out in waves. The senior officer's face turned crimson, but he didn't dare protest. He removed his badge and gun, handing them over with trembling hands. Marcus watched the scene unfold, his anger still simmering but tempered by a growing sense of satisfaction. Justice wasn't complete. Not yet. But it was a start. He turned to Clara, who was watching the detective with a look of quiet gratitude. "Thank you," Marcus said, his voice sincere. The detective nodded, her expression softening slightly. "Your mother deserves better than this," she said. "We all do. I'll make sure this is handled properly." As the disgraced officer was led away, the crowd began to disperse, their voices buzzing with excitement and relief. Marcus helped Clara to her feet, his arm around her shoulders as they made their way out of the mall. The ordeal wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time, Marcus felt a glimmer of hope. As they stepped into the cool evening air, Clara looked up at her son, her eyes shining with pride. "You didn't have to do all that," she said quietly. "Yes, I did," Marcus replied firmly. Because you deserve to be treated with respect. And because people like him need to learn that they can't get away with this." Clara smiled, a small but genuine smile that spoke volumes. For all the pain and humiliation she had endured that day, she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't alone. And with Marcus by her side, she never would be. The following days were a whirlwind of emotions and events, as the fallout from the mall incident rippled through the community like a stone dropped in still water. Marcus had barely slept since that day, his mind consumed with thoughts of what had happened and what needed to happen next. Clara, though still visibly shaken, was recovering physically, but the emotional scars were evident. She moved slower than usual, her usual warmth and cheerfulness dulled by the weight of the ordeal. Word of the incident spread rapidly. The videos captured by bystanders were uploaded to social media, garnering thousands of views within hours. Headlines in local news outlets painted a vivid picture of the events. Elderly woman assaulted by police officer in mall confrontation. Outrage erupts over officer's actions against beloved community member, and calls for accountability in shocking mall incident. Marcus watched as the story gained traction, the comment sections filling with both outrage and support for his mother. Marcus was no stranger to the legal system. His career as a lawyer had prepared him for battles of justice, but this time it was personal. He knew the process wouldn't be easy, but he also knew that allowing the incident to fade into the background wasn't an option. Clara deserved justice, and so did the community. The assault on his mother was a symptom of a much larger issue, one that Marcus was determined to address. The first step was filing a formal complaint with the police department. Marcus prepared the necessary documentation meticulously, his every word chosen with precision. He included the eyewitness accounts, the video evidence, and a detailed account of his mother's injuries. When he walked into the department headquarters, he was greeted with a mix of curiosity and unease. He felt the weight of every stare as he handed over the file to an officer at the front desk. "This is a formal complaint against Officer Reynolds," Marcus said, his voice steady but firm. "I expect it to be handled with the seriousness it deserves." The officer glanced at the file, then at Marcus, and nodded stiffly. "We'll investigate," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. Marcus wasn't satisfied with vague assurances. "I'll be following up," he said, his tone making it clear that he wouldn't be dismissed. "And I'll be monitoring every step of the investigation." As he left the building, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that justice wouldn't come easily. He knew how these things often went: delays, deflections, and ultimately, quiet resolutions that left the wronged parties feeling powerless. But this time would be different. Marcus wouldn't let them sweep this under the rug. Meanwhile, the community was rallying around Clara. Neighbors stopped by her house to check on her, bringing meals and flowers as tokens of their support. At the local church, the pastor dedicated a sermon to the incident, calling for unity and strength in the face of injustice. "We must stand together," he said, his voice ringing through the packed sanctuary. "Not just for Sister Clara, but for all who have been wronged and silenced." At the same time, a small but vocal faction emerged in defense of Officer Reynolds. Some argued that the videos didn't tell the whole story, that the officer was simply doing his job, and that the situation had been blown out of proportion. This group, though in the minority, stirred up tensions, leading to heated debates on social media and even in the streets. Marcus found himself at the center of the storm. His phone rang constantly, journalists seeking interviews, activists offering support, community members sharing their own stories of mistreatment. He quickly realized that this wasn't just about his mother anymore. Her story had become a catalyst, igniting a larger conversation about systemic racism and abuse of power. In the midst of all this, Marcus faced a difficult decision. His law firm, known for its conservative leanings, began to express discomfort with his public stance on the issue. During a tense meeting with the firm's partners, one of them spoke bluntly. "Marcus, we sympathize with what happened to your mother," the man said, his tone carefully measured. "But this crusade you're on, it's bringing a lot of attention to the firm. and not all of it is positive. Marcus stared at the man, his anger simmering just below the surface. A crusade, he repeated. My mother was assaulted by a police officer. This isn't a crusade. It's a fight for justice. The partner sighed. We understand that, but our clients, many of them have close ties to law enforcement. This could affect our reputation. Marcus realized then that he was at a crossroads. He could back down, prioritize his career and the firm's interests, or he could push forward, risking everything to stand up for what was right. The decision was clear, even if the consequences were daunting. I appreciate your concern, Marcus said, his voice steady. But if standing up for justice jeopardizes this firm's reputation, maybe this isn't the place for me. The room fell silent. Marcus knew the weight of his words, but he also knew he couldn't compromise his values. Not now, not ever. As he left the meeting, Marcus felt a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. He was stepping into the unknown, but he was doing it for the right reasons. He returned home to find Clara sitting on the porch, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. She looked up as he approached, her eyes filled with love and concern. Busy day? She asked, her voice soft. Marcus nodded, sitting down beside her. Busy, but productive, he said. He hesitated for a moment, then added, Mom, I need to ask you something. Are you sure you're okay with all of this? The attention, the interviews, the pressure. Clara smiled faintly, her gaze steady. Marcus, I didn't choose this fight, she said. But I'm proud to see you taking it on. If my pain can help bring about change, then it's worth it. Her words filled Marcus with a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about one incident. It was about challenging a system that had failed too many people for too long. And he was ready to see it through, no matter what it took. Over the next few weeks, Marcus worked tirelessly to build his case against Officer Reynolds. He held press conferences, met with community leaders, and collaborated with civil rights organizations. The momentum grew, drawing national attention to Clara's story. But with that attention came new challenges, threats, smears, and attempts to discredit both Marcus and Clara. Through it all, Marcus remained steadfast, his resolve unshaken. He knew that the road to justice was long and arduous, but he also knew that he wasn't walking it alone. The community, his family, and most importantly, his mother, were with him every step of the way. Together, they were determined to turn pain into progress, to ensure that what had happened to Clara wouldn't happen to anyone else. And in that determination, they found hope. The courtroom was packed to capacity on the day of the preliminary hearing, with people spilling into the hallways, eager to witness the unfolding of a case that had captivated the entire city. It was rare for a simple assault case to draw this kind of attention, but Clara Johnson's story had transcended the personal. It was no longer just about one woman's experience. It had become a battle over accountability, systemic injustice, and the power of a community standing together against oppression. Marcus stood at the front of the courtroom, flanked by his legal team. The past weeks had been grueling, a constant barrage of meetings, strategizing, and public appearances. He had spent countless hours poring over every piece of evidence, ensuring their case was airtight. But as he looked at his mother, sitting with quiet dignity in the first row, he knew that every sleepless night had been worth it. Clara, dressed in a modest navy blue dress, seemed calm, but Marcus could see the tension in her hands, folded neatly in her lap. She had been reluctant to step into the public eye, but as the days turned into weeks, she had found a strength she didn't know she had. She had spoken at community rallies, given interviews to national media outlets, and stood firm in the face of those who tried to dismiss her story. Now, as the first steps of the legal process began, she was ready to see it through. The prosecution, led by Marcus himself, began with a powerful opening statement. He laid out the facts with precision, painting a clear picture of what had happened in the mall that day. He emphasized the unnecessary aggression used by Officer Reynolds, the overwhelming evidence captured on video, and the emotional and physical harm inflicted on Clara. "This case is about more than one incident," Marcus said, his voice steady and commanding. "It's about a pattern of behavior that has gone unchecked for far too long. Officer Reynolds' actions were not just a violation of his duty, they were a violation of human decency, and they must not go unpunished." The defense, on the other hand, took a different approach. They argued that Officer Reynolds had acted within his authority, claiming he had reasonable suspicion to question Clara and had only used force when she resisted. They painted Reynolds as a dedicated officer who had made a mistake in a high-pressure situation. The crowd in the courtroom murmured in disapproval, but Marcus remained composed. He knew their argument wouldn't hold up under scrutiny, and he was ready to dismantle it piece by piece. The first witness was a young woman who had recorded the incident on her phone. Her testimony was clear and compelling, describing how Officer Reynolds had approached Clara without cause and escalated the situation unnecessarily. When her video was played for the court, showing Reynolds grabbing Clara's arm and pushing her to the ground, the gasps from the audience were audible. Next came the testimonies of other bystanders, each adding another layer of detail to the story. One man described how Clara had remained calm and respectful throughout the encounter, contradicting Reynolds' claim that she had been disruptive. Another witness recounted how Reynolds had ignored their attempts to intervene, dismissing them with hostility. As the evidence mounted, it became increasingly clear that Reynolds' actions had been unjustified. The defense tried to poke holes in the witnesses' credibility, but their efforts were clumsy and ineffective. The truth was undeniable, and everyone in the room could feel the tide turning. The trial became a spectacle that captured the attention of not just the city but the entire nation. News outlets from around the country sent reporters to cover the proceedings, and the courthouse steps were constantly crowded with activists, journalists, and community members demanding justice for Clara. The case had grown far beyond the incident in the mall. It was now a referendum on systemic inequality, police accountability, and the resilience of a community refusing to be silenced. Inside the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Each day of the trial brought new revelations and deeper insights into the complexities of the case. Marcus had meticulously prepared, leaving no detail overlooked, no stone unturned. This was more than a legal battle for him. It was a deeply personal mission to restore his mother's dignity and to hold a broken system accountable. The prosecution's case was built on 3 pillars: the video evidence, the testimonies of witnesses, and Officer Reynolds' own troubling history. Marcus had uncovered a series of complaints against Reynolds, many of which had been quietly dismissed over the years. While none of these complaints had led to disciplinary action, they painted a clear picture of a man who had repeatedly abused his authority. When Marcus presented this history in court, it was a turning point. "This isn't just about one bad decision," Marcus told the jury, his voice steady but impassioned. "This is about a pattern of behavior that has been ignored and excused for far too long. Officer Reynolds didn't just fail my mother that day. He failed the oath he took to serve and protect." The defense, by contrast, struggled to mount a compelling argument. They leaned heavily on the idea that Reynolds had acted in good faith, claiming that his actions were misinterpreted in the heat of the moment. But this narrative crumbled under the weight of the evidence. The videos, the eyewitness accounts, and Reynolds' own evasive testimony made it clear that his actions were not only unjustified but emblematic of a deeper bias. As the trial progressed, Clara continued to be a beacon of quiet strength. Though the constant media attention was exhausting, she never wavered in her commitment to see the process through. She became a symbol of resilience, not just for her family, but for the entire community. People from all walks of life reached out to her, sharing their own stories of injustice and offering their support. One evening, after a particularly grueling day in court, Clara and Marcus sat together on the porch of her modest home. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow over the neighborhood. Marcus looked at his mother, marveling at her calm demeanor despite everything she had endured. "You're incredible. You know that," he said, breaking the comfortable silence. Clara smiled, her eyes softening. "I'm just doing what I have to do," she replied. "But I couldn't have done any of this without you, Marcus. You've been my rock." Marcus shook his head. "No, Mom. You've always been the rock. I'm just trying to live up to your example." They sat in silence for a while, watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink. In that moment, despite the challenges they still faced, there was a sense of peace, a quiet acknowledgement of the strength they had found in each other. The trial's conclusion came with a mix of anticipation and anxiety. The jury deliberated for 2 days, their decision hanging over the city like a storm cloud. When the verdict was finally announced, the courtroom was packed to the brim, every eye fixed on the judge as he read the decision. "Guilty on all counts." The words reverberated through the room, followed by an explosion of emotion. Clara let out a quiet sigh of relief, her shoulders sagging as the weight of the ordeal finally began to lift. Marcus placed a comforting hand on her back, his own emotions threatening to overwhelm him. The officer's conviction was a victory, not just for their family, but for everyone who had been following the case. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted into cheers. People hugged, cried, and held up signs that read "Justice for Clara" and "Accountability for all." Marcus and Clara stepped out into the sunlight, greeted by a wave of applause and gratitude. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust in their direction, and questions filled the air. Marcus raised a hand to quiet the crowd. "This verdict is a step forward," he said, his voice carrying over the noise. "But it's just the beginning. True justice isn't just about one officer being held accountable. It's about changing the system that allowed this to happen in the first place. We have a long road ahead, but today we celebrate a victory for my mother, for our community, and for the idea that no one is above the law." The crowd roared in agreement, their energy infectious. For the first time in weeks, Clara allowed herself to smile, a genuine, radiant smile that spoke of relief, triumph, and hope. In the weeks that followed, the impact of the case was felt far and wide. The police department announced a series of reforms, including mandatory bias training and the establishment of a civilian oversight board. Community leaders organized forums to discuss systemic change, and the city began to take a hard look at its policies and practices. For Clara and Marcus, life slowly returned to normal, though the experience had left an indelible mark on them both. Clara found herself becoming a mentor to others who had faced injustice, sharing her story and encouraging them to speak out. Marcus, inspired by the case, shifted his focus to civil rights law, dedicating himself to fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves. One evening, as they sat together in Clara's living room, she turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "You know," she said, "I used to think that what happened to me was the worst thing that could have ever happened. But now I see it differently." "How so?" Marcus asked, intrigued. Clara smiled, her eyes filled with a quiet wisdom. "It brought people together. It made them see what's wrong and what needs to change. And it reminded me that no matter how dark things get, there's always light if you're willing to look for it." Marcus nodded, his heart swelling with pride and gratitude. "You're the light, Mom," he said softly. "You always have been." As the two of them sat together, surrounded by the warmth of their home, they knew that their journey had changed them, and their community, for the better. The fight for justice was far from over, but they were ready to face whatever came next, armed with the strength of their convictions and the power of their shared resolve. But the most powerful moment came when Clara herself took the stand. Her voice was steady as she recounted the events of that day, her words painting a vivid picture of her fear, confusion, and humiliation. She spoke not just about what had happened to her, but about the deeper pain it had caused. "I've lived in this community for over 40 years, Clara said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I've raised my children here, shopped in that mall countless times, and never once imagined that I would be treated like a criminal for simply existing. What happened to me that day wasn't just an attack on my dignity. It was an attack on everything I've stood for, everything I've worked to build." Her words brought many in the audience to tears, and even the judge looked moved. Marcus watched his mother with pride, her strength and resilience shining through every word. When it was time for Officer Reynolds to testify, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. The once confident officer now appeared nervous, his bravado replaced by a quiet unease. Under cross-examination, Marcus asked him pointed questions, forcing him to confront the inconsistencies in his story. "Officer Reynolds," Marcus said, his tone sharp but controlled, "you claim that my mother was a threat. Can you explain how an elderly woman with no history of criminal behavior posed a danger to you?" Reynolds hesitated, his gaze darting toward his attorney. She was acting suspiciously," he said weakly. "Suspiciously?" Marcus pressed. "By shopping for groceries? By walking through a public space? Or was her real crime simply being black in a place where you didn't think she belonged?" The courtroom fell silent, the weight of Marcus's words hanging in the air. Reynolds fumbled for a response but found none. His silence spoke volumes, and the damage to his credibility was irreparable. As the hearing drew to a close, the judge announced that there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial. The room erupted in applause, the sound a mixture of relief and triumph. Marcus turned to Clara, who gave him a small, proud smile. It was just the beginning, but it was a victory nonetheless. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered, holding signs that read "Justice for Clara" and "End Police Brutality." Marcus addressed the crowd, his voice filled with determination. "This is not the end," he said. "This is just the first step in a long journey. We're not just fighting for my mother. We're fighting for every person who has ever been mistreated, disrespected, or dehumanized. And we will not stop until justice is served." The crowd cheered, their voices echoing through the streets. For the first time in weeks, Marcus felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but he knew they were on the right path. Together, they would ensure that what had happened to Clara would never happen again, and in doing so, they would create a future where dignity, respect, and justice were not privileges, but rights for all.